as we begin now our 16th lecture in our series on Christianity and the history of it, we're going to consider now Christianity in what I would call Christianity in a more modern world. And this pretty much emerges after the smoke and dust have cleared away after the Reformation and the 100 years or so of battles and conflict following the Reformation. There were many post-Reformation philosophical challenges to Christianity. The Enlightenment movement was seen in a particularly clear-cut form in 18th century Germany. Karl Barth, I think, well described the Enlightenment as a system founded on the presupposition of faith in the omnipotence of human ability. In other words, what Enlightenment thinking, what modern thinking was all about was a very high degree of confidence in human ability to solve problems and to find the answers of life. This kind of thinking, you could say, was defined by Immanuel Kant in his book, Religion Within the Bounds of Reason Only. Reason was one of the dominant concepts of the Enlightenment and of modern thinking. In that book, Kant wrote this: "The Enlightenment represents man's emergence from a self-inflicted state of minority. A minor is one who is incapable of making use of his understanding without guidance from someone else. Have the courage to make use of your own understanding is therefore the watchword of the Enlightenment." So the Enlightenment, this rationalism, very much the thinking was that human beings need to step up and take responsibility and solve the world's problems and start having confidence in their potential to do these things. It was very much predicated upon the reliability of reason. And therefore the Enlightenment rejected both supernatural revelation and man's sinfulness. The Enlightenment showed forth God being an all-wise creator, but He planted within man what you might call a natural religion. The Enlightenment, maybe in its core, didn't deny God, it just ignored Him. You don't need to look to God anymore. Human reason can do the job. Now, from the rise of Christianity through the post-Reformation era, through the period of church history that we've looked at so far, the basic questions of humanity remained the same. The basic questions were something like this: what is true Christianity? How can man be right with God? And so forth. There was disagreement about the answers among different Christians, right? For example, a Protestant or a Catholic or Anabaptist might give you different answers to those questions, but the questions were generally agreed upon. Beginning in the 1700s, basic challenges emerged which changed the very questions that people asked about God and Christianity. In the medieval mind, they were concerned with the question, how can I be right with God? And the Roman Catholic Church had an answer to that question, didn't it? How would the Roman Catholic Church answer the question, how can I be right with God? By the sacraments, right? You're right with God because of your connection with the church, and your connection with the church comes through the 7 sacraments. Through the Enlightenment, people stopped thinking so much about God. Now they were thinking about man. And since the Enlightenment, the predominant question that people ask in society is no longer, how can I be right with God? What's the more fundamental question that people ask today and for the last few hundred years? The more fundamental question is not, how can I be right with God? It's, how can I be happy? Right? That's a pretty dramatic change. Now the question is, how can I be a better person? How can I find fulfillment in life? These are the most fundamental questions in human society since the development of modernity or the modern world. Again, you have to admit, it's a huge shift in thinking. Do you remember that illustration I gave you of the mercenary soldiers who would go from city to city and cloister to cloister and rob and rape and pillage? And these particular ones in the negotiations with the monks at the cloister were insisting that they be given a letter of the forgiveness of sins so that they could know that they were going to heaven. That's a very dramatic way of showing that these men, who hardly had a moral bone in their body, still had the question very heavy on their mind, how can I be right with God? Now they answered the question in completely the wrong way. In their minds, they could be right with God by getting a letter from a monk that said their sins were forgiven. That's the completely wrong answer. But at least we would approve of the question that they were asking. Now when Christians live today to answer those questions in the lives of other people, when we present Christianity primarily as the path to happiness or primarily as the path to self-fulfillment, it's a very difficult thing for us to do it. I like what C.S. Lewis said about this. He said, I didn't go to religion to make me happy. I always knew that a bottle of wine would do that. If you want a religion to make you feel really comfortable, I certainly don't recommend Christianity. And there's some real truth to what C.S. Lewis said, right? Because the fundamental goal of Christianity is not to make people happy, though we believe it does. It's not to give human fulfillment, though we believe it does. The fundamental goal of Christianity is to make somebody right with God and to bring them into a relationship of fellowship and communion with God. John Gerstner, a lecturer on history, he calls the Enlightenment the Endarklement. Because in spite of the many contributions to culture, science, and industry that the Enlightenment made, listen, the modern world that we live in has been tremendously shaped by the Enlightenment. Modern science, modern technology, modern research, modern medicine, all of those things have their root in this sort of unleashing of the human spirit in the Enlightenment that says, you can discover the world, go out and find it. We owe a lot to the Enlightenment. However, despite all the gains that we've received from the Enlightenment and from this manner of thinking, you could say that it was a crass naturalism that denied God and especially His saving revelation. It's not an inaccurate way to describe the Enlightenment and rationalism to say that it was a way for man to gain the whole world and lose his soul. Now, as an aspect of this rise and this Enlightenment sort of thinking, there is the rise of confidence in science and what I would call scientism. This refers to the emergence of the scientific method, advancing the idea that an intelligent person is skeptical about everything, and that you should believe nothing that cannot be proved in a laboratory. Therefore, if it can't be proved empirically or by the scientific method, you shouldn't believe in it. Now, this developed into what we call form criticism as it is applied to the biblical sources. Form criticism is a method of literary study that can be applied to both sacred or secular literature. It seeks to understand and to classify the sources that underlie documents, and if possible, to reconstruct the processes by which the document came about. Now, using this approach, German theologians advanced the idea that the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, the first 5 books of Moses, that they came from several different sources that began as oral traditions, which are eventually written down and then were drawn together by a later author. This is commonly called the JEDP theory, or the documentary hypothesis. The idea is that the J represents the Jehovah source, or Yahweh. E represents the Elohim source. D represents the Deuteronomic source. And P represents the priestly source. Now, another factor in the rise of scientism was the emergence of technology and the evaporating sense of dependence upon God. Let me explain to you what I mean by that. The more technology you have, the less you sense your dependence on God. Now, I'm not saying that you depend on God less, or that you need to depend on God less. I'm just saying you sense your need for dependence upon God less. After all, who needs to have a deeper prayer life? The farmer who waters his crop by irrigation and sprinklers, or the farmer who has to wait for the rain? I'd say the farmer has to wait for the rain. He's probably going to have a deeper prayer life. Who's going to have the deeper prayer life? The fisherman whose boat is powered by the wind in his sails, or the fisherman in a motorboat? You see what I mean? Technology gives man a sense of independence from God. So the scientific method would be applied to biblical sources, and sometimes in very unjust and unjustifiable ways. Now listen, I think that on basis, we don't mind the Bible being examined according to very strict scientific criteria. We don't mind when researchers say, hey, let's see if we can figure things out about the Bible and its sources or authorship. What we protest against, or I'll just speak for myself, what I protest against as a student of the Bible is when such things are are applied unfairly or in a manner to biblical documents far, far beyond they would any other kind of document. So we don't mind scientific inquiry, it just has to be honest. And we also have to recognize that when a scientist makes up his mind, I'm sure Laurie Brown spoke to you about this in apologetics and such, but when scientists make up their mind that there is no supernatural, or that there can never be a supernatural explanation of things, that is a presupposition that is made apart from science. That's a philosophical presupposition. It's not a scientific presupposition. Now, the rise of secularism is also connected with this rising confidence in science and scientism. Secularism is a term invented to indicate a way of life which leaves out the consideration of God, revelation, heaven and hell, but bases morality on that which benefits the public good. The term and the thinking became associated more and more with atheism and became associated with the idea that religion should not be taught in the public schools. It's really the idea that society doesn't need God. And that probably individuals, so if you want to study religion as your own individual thing, fine. But society and individuals don't really need God. Yes?
What you said that idea was?
Secularism. Now, secularism was hugely important in the 20th century. Communism, Western materialism became dominant ideas in the 20th century because of the rise of secularism. Again, it's manifested in these ideas that say society doesn't need God. Now, as all of this relates to the Christian church and to theology, this rise of modernistic, Enlightenment, rationalistic thought. By the way, I'm using those terms as rough equivalents. That's not being very precise, but this isn't a course on philosophy, it's a course on history, and it's a very brief course on history as it is. I'm going to use those terms in rough agreement with each other. Modernism, Enlightenment thinking, rationalism to be roughly the same. Now, the rise of modernism and theological liberalism can be traced back to men like Fredrich Schleiermacher. Now let me explain to you what this is all about. Modernism basically is the idea that adopts a hypercritical attitude towards the idea that God speaks to man and towards revelation. They look at the Bible and they don't look at it as God's book, because we stopped assigning things to God. Now we look at it as a book that came from men, and now it's just a matter for us to decide what kind of men brought it forth and in what kind of circumstances. In the late 19th century, the rise of theological liberalism brought forth generations of Christian pastors, leaders, and theologians who denied many of the fundamentals of biblical Christianity. You see, modernism, rationalism, Enlightenment thinking tells you there is no such thing as the supernatural. Therefore, when you read your Bible and it describes for you a miracle, you know right away that it didn't happen. One good and interesting Bible commentator is a guy named William Barclay. Have any of you ever read any William Barclay? Excellent Bible commentator on the New Testament. Well, excellent in one sense. William Barclay will give you excellent word studies. He'll give you excellent historical background on New Testament events and New Testament words. Really good in those two areas. But William Barclay was essentially a modernist Christian in his thinking. And so basically, he denied miracles. So when William Barclay opens up his Bible and reads the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000, he'll say, oh yes, it's a miracle. But the miracle of the loaves and the fishes was not a miracle of Jesus actually taking a few loaves and a few fish and with that miraculously feeding thousands of people. He'll say the miracle was a miracle of sharing. Because as one little boy came out and shared his lunch, shared his bread, shared his fish, then everybody else who had this food with them but were hiding it because they didn't want to share it with everybody, when they saw the little boy's example of sharing, they opened up their hearts and they wanted to share as well. And so William Barclay would say, yes, it's a miracle, but not a supernatural miracle. It's a miracle of sharing that happens in the human heart. So sometimes when I read William Barclay, I say, oh, thank you, Mr. Barclay, for your insight into the ancient words and into the ancient history. And other times I want to throw the William Barclay commentary across the room. But again, Barclay is a good example of this thinking that basically says, belief in miracles or the miraculous is superstitious. We live in a modern world. When somebody is sick today, we don't say it's because some demon has infected them. In the modern world, we know it's because some virus or some germ has bothered them, and we need to address that source. This idea of demon possession, or spiritual worlds, or this or that, or other things that we would assign off to the supernatural, these are relics of primitive thought. Now man has been unleashed from the shackles of primitive thought, and in today's world, he can think in an entirely different way. Now, what I want you to notice is these Christian modernists, or Christian liberals, they would say, theological liberals, it was not in their mind to deny Christianity, though I believe they did, but it was in their mind to transform Christianity and make it suitable for a modern world. This was a broad and varied movement, and at its root, theological liberalism believed that Christianity had to re-evaluate all of its doctrines in light of modern science, philosophy, and thinking. They rejected the idea that a doctrine is true just because the Bible teaches it, because the Bible for them is a fundamentally unreliable book because it contains so many things that are obviously not true. For them, the Bible has good parts in it, to be sure, but fundamentally it's an unreliable book, and so it's not enough just to say, the Bible says it, I believe it. They believed that the Bible was not an inspired message from a real God, but rather it was the work of men who were limited by ignorance or the superstitions of their time. Therefore, doctrines or truth had to be proved as much by reason and experience as much as by a claim to the Bible. So again, for them, the Bible was not inspired by God. It was not supernatural. It was important, but it was more important for its moral teaching than for anything else. Now, Germany really took the lead in theological liberalism, and German philosophers and theologians had a profound impact on British and American Christians. Men like Immanuel Kant, Fredrich Schleiermacher, George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, and the Tübingen School of Theology and Adolf Harnack all had a huge impact. And this particular man that you see up on the PowerPoint right now, Fredrich Schleiermacher, this man did a very critical book in 1799 called Religion, Speeches to Its Cultured Despisers. In many ways, this was the debut of liberal theology, saying that the essence of religion is not doctrines or theologies, but the essence of religion is feeling. He said this, True religion is sense and taste for the infinite. In other words, true religion is just this feeling for the infinite that you have within your breast. It is sometimes regarded as a theological expression of Romanticism. It was trying to make sense of the Christian faith in a world that was denying the supernatural and looking more and more to the interior of the person for what was true and right. You see, I want you to know, Schleiermacher didn't just say that religion was more than knowledge and action. We would say that the Christian life is more than knowledge and action, but that it was distinct from knowledge and action. He says this: ideas and principles are foreign to all religion. If ideas and principles are to be anything, they must belong to knowledge, which is of a different department of life from religion. And so basically, what Schleiermacher said, and what many people said after him, he was sort of the trailblazer who had many followers. In essence, they said that Christianity, and all of religion for that matter, is a feeling of complete dependence upon God, and really not much more. Now, Schleiermacher wanted to defend Christianity against the threat of the Enlightenment, but he did it with the thinking of the Enlightenment, right? He adopts the thinking and the phrasing and the vocabulary of the Enlightenment, and in my view, he completely gives away the store. His arguments for Christianity were based on man-centered feelings for God and spirituality, not on biblical revelation or historical events. So for a guy like Schleiermacher, basically the Bible doesn't really matter. What matters are your feelings for God, and as much as the Bible helps you to have deeper and better and more profound feelings for God, then the Bible's good. Now, another notable man in this sort of chain was a man named Adolf von Harnack. Harnack was the son of a Lutheran scholar and a university professor. He taught at Leipzig, at Gießen, at Marburg, and at Berlin. His last appointment was challenged by church leaders because he doubted the traditional authorship of several New Testament books. In the years 1899 and 1900, he taught a series of lectures titled, "What is Christianity?" And in these lectures, he very clearly spelled out his beliefs. He said that Jesus was a man who had rest and peace for his soul, and he was able to give life and strength to others by his inspiring example. Now again, this is a very critical idea in this development of liberal or modernistic Christian theology. The idea that Jesus is important as an example. The gospel he preached was not about himself, according to von Harnack, but about his Father. His gospel is about the kingdom of God, the fatherhood of God, the infinite value of the human soul, but really not so much about himself or salvation. Von Harnack also introduced the idea that historically the truth of Christianity is different from what we see in the New Testament. He made the distinction between the Jesus of the Gospels and the Jesus of history. Listen, for us who believe the Bible, there is no difference between the Jesus of the Gospels and the Jesus of history, right? But for a guy like von Harnack and other people in his train, there's a huge difference. The Jesus of the Gospels is not the real Jesus. And therefore, writers and theologians for a good time after this became very interested or obsessed with the idea of finding the real Jesus. Now, you and I would say, you want to find the real Jesus? Look to the Gospels. But from this Enlightenment mentality, they would protest, no, the Gospels aren't reliable because the Gospels show us a supernatural world, a pre-modern world, a primitive world, and these guys were not speaking by any distinct inspiration of God or the Holy Spirit. Liberalism grew and influenced Christianity and society up until the present day. It offered a stream of Christianity that was not really Christian at all. Basically, it said the core of Christianity is community and social action. It's not doctrine. It's not the Bible. That's not the core of Christianity. They were interested in Jesus as an example of community and social action. Therefore, the Bible was not so important to them, though they kept their Bibles. It's not like they burned Bibles, but they just didn't regard them anymore as being finally authoritative. Now, J. Gresham Machen was a conservative critic of the modernistic movement who was very important. He wrote an outstanding book, Christianity and Liberalism. Now, I don't know if you can pick it up just from the title, but his title was a way of throwing the glove down of a challenge to his readers right away. Because what he said, basically in the title, is that Christianity was distinct from liberalism, right? You've got Christianity and you've got liberalism. A guy like von Harnack or Henry Emerson Fosdick or other people in that chain, these modernistic liberal Christians would say Christianity is liberalism. But J. Gresham Machen said, no, it's different, it's distinct. In his book, which was written in 1923, he said this: "The purpose of this book is not to decide the religious issue of the present day, but merely to persuade or to present the issue as sharply and clearly as possible in order that the reader may be aided in deciding it for himself." He said, in the sphere of religion in particular, the present time is a time of conflict. The great redemptive religion, which has always been known as Christianity, is battling against a totally diverse type of religious belief, which is only the more destructive of the Christian faith because it makes use of the traditional terminology. The modern non-redemptive religion is called modernism or liberalism. Now again, modern theological liberalism has had very little popular influence, but it has had a very significant influence in academia. What I mean by having very little popular influence is that if you go to modernistic or liberal churches today, you will find them for the most part empty. Common people don't turn to modernistic or liberalistic churches for answers, because all the answers they have to give are the answers of social action and community. They can't give answers from the Bible. I know that would sound like a biased statement, but I believe it very truly. Theological liberalism has very little popular influence, but it has a very significant influence in academia. Its emphasis is on Christianity that preaches the fatherhood of God, the brotherhood of man, social action and social justice. It denies the deity of Jesus Christ. It denies the Trinity. It denies the inerrant Scriptures. It denies the fall of man. It denies the wrath of God. It denies salvation only through the atoning blood of the cross. Again, it's basically feeling that it has to change Christianity radically in order so that it will meet the challenges of a modern world. Now, I want to get a little bit ahead of myself, just so the point is extremely clear to everybody. I want you to notice the remarkable similarities to the way that the church embraced modernism and came up with these kind of doctrines, and with the way that the church today is embracing postmodernism and is coming up with similar doctrines. I tell you that as much as the church buys into postmodernism, it will consign itself to the same fate as liberal Christianity. It will. It will marginalize itself, and it will make itself completely ineffective. It will come to the same fate. These churches will become empty. Not right away. Listen, the effect of modernism was not immediately apparent upon the churches. Liberalistic, modernistic churches were filled for several years. It's not like immediately they emptied out. But as sure as the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, they emptied eventually because they didn't have biblical answers for people. I find it frightening how in some segments of the church today, they are rushing to embrace postmodernism under the same rationale that the church rushed to embrace modernism 150 years ago or so, and I think the same thing will be the result of it. Now, there were basically three responses to the rise of theological liberalism. The three responses to this rise are expressed in fundamentalism, Neo-Orthodoxy, and Evangelicalism. Fundamentalism was a series, let me back up. The Fundamentals were a series of 12 small books published from 1910 to 1915 containing articles and essays that were designed to defend fundamental Christian truths. 3 million copies of these books were sent free to every theological student and every Christian worker whose addresses could be obtained. The project was funded by a guy named Lyman Stewart, who was a wealthy California oil man. And so these are some of the examples of the chapter titles in the Fundamentals. The history of higher criticism, the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch, the fallacies of higher criticism, the Bible in modern criticism, Christ in criticism, 1 Isaiah. It's sort of axiomatic among higher critics that Isaiah has 2 or sometimes even 3 authors. The testimony of the monuments to the truth of Scriptures, recent testimony of archaeology of the Scriptures, science and the Christian faith. Now, the term fundamentalism came to be used loosely for all theological conservatism, as opposed to theological liberalism. Now, sadly, fundamentalism came to be associated with legalism, anti-intellectualism, and a self-imposed cultural isolation. Therefore, the term came to be avoided, and many Christians called themselves by another term, which we'll discuss a little bit later, called evangelical. The evangelical movement began in the 20th century, used to describe the international movement committed to historical Protestant understanding of the gospel. Evangelicalism wanted to distinguish itself from Protestant liberals, from Roman Catholics, and from groups that they regarded as cults, such as the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons. There were many groups that were mostly evangelical, but had an evangelical group and a liberal or a modernistic group. For example, I'll give you one. I mean, this could be repeated in several denominations, but one striking example would be the Methodists. Within the Methodist denomination, in the early part of the 20th century, there developed a liberal modernistic group within the denomination and a evangelical or fundamentalist group. One group that was theologically liberal and one group that was theologically conservative, right? And these two groups would battle it out for who was going to dominate the direction of the denomination. Because they just believed very strongly, each one in their own way, that their direction was the right way for the denomination. Now, the strength of modernism began to decline in the aftermath of World War I. It's very interesting. Part of the reason for modernism and the glory, if you want to say, and I say that sort of tongue-in-cheek, the glory of the Enlightenment and rationalism, was they had this unshakable confidence in human progress. They really believed that history was going from one great thing to another great thing. And this is how they really believed at the end of the 19th century. And as they were beginning to come into the 20th century, you know, at the end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s, there was this really strong sense of confidence that the 20th century would be the Christian century. Christians really had this confidence in the progress of human endeavor, of human thinking, of rationalism and modernism. However, that confidence in human thinking and human work was absolutely crushed by the First World War. The First World War was a devastating blow to the self-confidence of the entire world, but especially of Europe. It was hard to be so confident in human progress after the death, the carnage, and the futility of the First World War. Well, the Second World War followed fast enough upon the First World War. And after the First World War, Karl Barth and the rise of biblical theology movements, where the more conservative approach to the biblical text came about. You could say that Neo-Orthodoxy was a reaction to the excesses of liberalism without wanting to try to leave some of its basic tenets. Basically, Neo-Orthodoxy wanted to keep the fundamental truths of the Protestant faith, but it felt that those truths needed to be restated and re-explained in light of a modern world. Therefore, it brought about a renewed emphasis on Jesus Christ and faith on Him, but without really saying that you had to return to what the Bible said about Jesus. You see, the idea was that the important Jesus was not so much the Jesus of the Bible, but the Jesus that we experience existentially. The idea advanced by the Neo-Orthodox people was basically this, that the Bible is not the Word of God, but it contains the Word of God. The true Word of God is revealed by the Spirit as the Bible is preached. A real leader of this Neo-Orthodox movement was a man named Karl Barth. He was a Swiss theologian who studied in Switzerland and Germany under some of the greatest theological minds of his day, who, needless to say, were liberals. He wrote a very important commentary on Romans in 1919 when he was the pastor of a small church in a Swiss town, right in the middle of the crisis and the despair of World War I. In it, he broke with liberal theology, finding the liberal gospel of the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man simply too shallow and unable to explain man's need and the world's crisis. And so Barth is an example of a man who was a sold-out liberal, yet he realized the emptiness of it, and he wanted the true gospel. But he didn't want to become one of those fundamentalists. And so his classic commentary on Romans stressed conservative ideas about God, but without the same supports of traditional Christianity. In other words, he took God and sin and salvation seriously, but it was liberal enough to frustrate conservatives. But liberals didn't like Barth's commentaries either. They described Barth's commentaries, a liberal theologian, described Barth's commentary on Romans as a bomb falling on the happy playground of theologians. For example, Karl Barth thought that the resurrection of Jesus was true, but not the literal, historical resurrection of Jesus, because that was improvable and ultimately not important. What was important was the message of his resurrection. One man summarized his belief in the belief of Karl Barth by saying this: Karl Barth believed there is no God, and His Son is Jesus Christ. In other words, he bought into some of the liberal modernistic stuff, but also he definitely had a more conservative evangelical idea. One historian put Barth's thinking this way. He said, I'll agree with the smart liberals that Christianity cannot be proved. And then I will enjoy the gospel feast, which the ignorant fundamentalists think can be proved. In some ways, Barth wanted to have the best of both worlds. Now again, I have to stress with you this idea that modernism and liberal theology had completely overwhelmed, or almost completely overwhelmed, the academic system, both with Christian universities and colleges and seminaries and with secular ones. To the point that it really became just assumed that any intelligent person believed these things. Let me tell you, you always have to watch out for that, because the same tendency is present today. There's sort of this snooty, academic kind of thinking that says, well, all intelligent people believe this, blah, 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 blah. Listen, those are fundamental things that you should question. First of all, maybe they're wrong. But secondly, it's certainly not true just because, so to speak, all intelligent people believe it. And these things have to be very fundamentally questioned. There are many Christians who go into deep doctrinal compromise because they long to be seen as one of the smart guys. Let me say that again. There are many, many Christians who go into doctrinal compromise because they long to be accepted and seen as one of the smart guys. And so if all the smart people believe this, I guess I should believe it also. It's a very common trap for Christians to go into. Well, against modern theological liberalism, I think we can take a definition of evangelicalism from Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones. where he talked about what an evangelical Christian is. He said that an evangelical Christian, and this is from his good little book, What is an Evangelical?, which I highly recommend to you. He said an evangelical is entirely subservient to the Bible. An evangelical is always watching. He distrusts reason, and particularly reason in the form of philosophy. He has a particular view regarding the sacraments. He has a critical view of history and tradition. He is always ready to act on what he believes. He's a man who always simplifies everything. That's very important. You know, listen, when you hear theologians talk or when you read their writings and they don't make it simple enough for you to understand, listen, read it again, read it carefully, and if you can't understand it, don't think it's your fault, it's his fault for not putting it in a way that you can understand. Honestly. This idea that the more incomprehensible you are, the smarter you are, and the more scholarly you are, it's just a bunch of nonsense. If you're really smart, if you really know your subject, you can put it in terms that people can understand. An evangelical is always concerned about the doctrine of the church. He puts a tremendous emphasis on the new birth. He pays a great attention to the way he lives. His interest is in revival. He always gives a primary place to preaching, and he's always concerned about evangelism. What is an evangelical? By Martin Lloyd-Jones. Yeah. And I agree with Lloyd-Jones on these characteristics of what evangelicalism is about. Now again, let's talk a little bit about the 20th century. Because as the Western world, as I repeated before, as the Western world, including Europe, America, and the colonies influenced by them, as they entered the 20th century, there was tremendous optimism. They believed in human progress. They believed in the incredible century of Christian advance. By the way, we'll talk about this in our next lecture when we talk about the modern missionary movement. The most remarkable century of Christian advance in the history of Christianity was the 19th century, the 1800s. It was a remarkable period of Christian advance all over the world. Christians had reason to believe that it was just going to go from glory to glory, and as I said before, that the 20th century would be a Christian century. By the way, even a magazine of that title was started, the Christian Century. And today, it's an extremely liberal and modernistic Christian magazine. But the harsh realities of World War I dealt a harsh blow to this optimistic dream. In that war, the loss of life devastated Europe. Italy lost 500,000 men. Britain and the British Empire lost almost 1 million. Austria and Hungary lost 1.2 million. France lost 1.4 million. Russia lost 1.7 million. And Germany lost 1.8 million men in World War I. It was horrible. Almost beyond description. Especially because at the end of it all, it seemed pretty much like the war was fought and lost for nothing. Nothing really happened. At least in the Second World War, there was satisfaction from at least the Allied powers that they had carried on a righteous crusade, so to speak. In the Second World War, there was not the same feeling after the First World War. After World War I, nobody believed in a Christian century. And so, the important movements of the 20th century, if I could sum them up very quickly, you have some interesting developments with the rise of parachurch organizations. You understand what a parachurch organization is? A parachurch organization is like Campus Crusade for Christ, or InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, or Operation Mobilization, or Samaritan's Purse. These are organizations that are not churches, but their idea is that they will come alongside churches. Now, these weren't invented in the 20th century. There had been, if you will, parachurch organizations for a couple of centuries before, but they really increased in strength and prominence in the 20th century. Another important trend in the 20th century was the declining importance of denominations. This is very, very important. By now, as we are in the 21st century, denominations become less and less important. There aren't many people who go into a town now and look for a church by its denomination. Now people tend to judge churches independently, and they don't really care much about the denomination affiliation of the church. They're willing to judge the church just as it is in itself. But there was a time that when you were a Baptist and you moved to a new town, you looked for the Baptist church in town, and you wouldn't dream of going anywhere else because you were a Baptist. Now, when that same Baptist goes into town, he probably doesn't think of himself as a Baptist. He thinks of himself as a Christian. And he'll take a look at 4, 5, 6 other churches, and he'll fit the one that he believes best suits his needs. Denominationalism has declined in importance radically. In the 20th century, you had the Pentecostal and the charismatic resurgences, which have been very important historically. We'll talk a little bit about that more in a future lecture. And then you've had great revivals and great persecutions in the 20th century, what you might call the rise of global Christianity. And of course, you had the church and relevance issues that you find today. Let me conclude this lecture with a few words on postmodernism. The idea of postmodernism today is that there is no longer a single story, so to speak, or a single worldview that holds Western culture together. It's that truth is much more individualized. There's no one truth that means the same to every person. The naturalists have their story, the pantheists have their story, the Christians have theirs, going on and on and on. And the idea of postmodernism is that all these stories are equally valid. Let me see if I can explain to you a little bit more about postmodernism by comparing it to other ways of thinking. The pre-modern idea, that is the Western world prior to the 17th century, says that a just society is based on a revelation from a just God. The modern society, beginning with Descartes, René Descartes, famous French philosopher, basically says that we should use reason to build a just society. Now you notice the difference between the pre-modern and the modern. The modern pretty much abandons the idea of God, right? The modern says, we don't need God to build a just society. We don't need the Bible. We can do it by rationalism. We can do it by science and build a just society. But the postmodern idea, again, there's a lot of arguments as to when postmodernism begins. I'm throwing out here as it began with Friedrich Nietzsche. If you want to argue about that, it doesn't really matter to me. But the postmodern idea is basically denying that there's a universal standard for justice. Therefore, you could say that society moves from medieval hierarchy to Enlightenment democracy to postmodern anarchy. Because postmodern reject the idea that there is such a thing as authority or any universal governing authority. So postmodernism basically says this: the truth about reality might be out there, but it's forever hidden from us. So all we can do is tell stories. And we'll tell stories. You see, if real truth is not possible or even desired in postmodernism, then the result is a greater emphasis on relationships, honesty, and non-judgmentalism. Tolerance is one of the big watchwords of postmodernism. And so, the basic idea comes down to this. Christianity is confronted with a new philosophical system, which, by the way, postmodernism is so young, I think it's impossible to tell what it will develop into or where it will go next. In my mind, this is an unfinished philosophical system. It's too late to say whether or not it has really replaced modernism. The bottom line is this: just as it was dangerous for the church to allow modernism to dictate its theology, so I believe it is dangerous for the church to let postmodernism dictate its theology. If postmodernism says that real truth is not possible to be known, the last thing that the church needs to do is abandon the Bible as the standard of truth. No, we need to promote the Bible as the place of truth. Just because pre-modernism says that the Bible or real truth isn't knowable, we can't give up on it. In the Middle Ages, it was said that theology is the queen of the sciences. In the Enlightenment, they say that philosophy, and especially science, is the most important pursuit. But in the postmodern age, they say literary theory, telling stories, is what leads the way. I think any one of those is dangerous. Medieval theology had its problem. Modern love for science and philosophy had its problem. And the postmodern love of telling the story and of that kind of narrative has its problems. What we need to get back to and stay with all of our strength is a thoroughly biblical theology.